Okay, so picture this. You're walking down the street and you see someone struggling with like an ancient piece of tech, like a phone that's taking like 5 minutes to load a web page, you know? You kind of chuckle to yourself, right? Like, wow, look at that. That's so old. But here's the thing. How often do we actually stop and examine the outdated software that we might be running in our own heads? Like our own, long-held beliefs and assumptions. The things that we just kind of take for granted as true.
It's a fascinating quirk of human nature, isn't it?
Yeah.
Like we rush to download the latest app update, but when it comes to updating our perspectives, our knowledge, our opinions, there's often a lot more resistance there.
It's so true. And psychologists actually have a term for this. They call it seizing and freezing. And it refers to this tendency that we have to grab onto our beliefs and just freeze them in place. We find comfort in those convictions even when the world around us has moved on.
Yeah. I think we often gravitate towards information that just simply confirms what we already think, rather than really engaging with ideas that might actually challenge us to think differently.
Right, and that's exactly what we're diving into today in this deep dive. We're going to explore this reluctance to rethink why it can hold us back, and more importantly, how we can get better at it. And to guide us on this journey, we have Adam Grant's book, Think Again.
And consider this deep dive your shortcut to understanding why it's so crucial for you, the learner, to actively rethink your assumptions in various aspects of your life.
Yeah, and our mission today is to make this both insightful and practical.
Exactly. So we have 3 clear goals for you today. First, we're going to illustrate just how vital this ability to rethink truly is, using some pretty compelling real-world examples.
Okay.
Second, we're going to unpack those common mental roadblocks, the ones that prevent us from actually hitting that refresh button in our own minds.
Yeah.
And finally, we'll equip you with practical strategies that you can use to cultivate this think again mindset, both in your personal life and your work life.
I love it. So we're going for those aha moments without, making it too overwhelming.
Exactly.
Yeah.
We want you to come away from this with a new perspective.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So to do all of that, we'll be drawing primarily from Adam Grant's Think. Again, we'll be extracting the key insights, connecting them to your experiences, and I think this will resonate with a lot of people. So are you ready to dive in?
Absolutely. Let's do it.
Okay, let's start with a powerful example that shows what happens when our ingrained thinking fails us in like a high-pressure situation.
Okay, so let's rewind back to 1949. There was this disastrous wildfire in Montana, the Matamon Gulch Fire.
Oh, yeah.
And a team of smoke jumpers were sent in to try to contain it, and leading them was this experienced foreman named Wagner Dodge.
And what makes this story so powerful is how quickly the situation escalated, right? The fire just surged unexpectedly, and the smoke jumpers found themselves in a desperate fight for survival. They were racing uphill, which is standard procedure when you're facing a wildfire. But Dodge, in a moment of remarkable clarity, he did something that went completely against their training.
Yeah, he did something radical as the fire was closing in on them. He made this split-second decision to light a backfire. He actually set fire to the grass in front of their position to create a burned-over area with no fuel for the main fire to consume.
It's amazing, and his reasoning was sound, but it completely contradicted everything the other smoke jumpers had learned about how to survive a fire.
Yeah, and tragically, they couldn't process it in time.
Yeah.
They continued running uphill away from Dodge's safety zone because his actions just didn't compute.
Yeah.
It didn't fit with their understanding of fire survival.
Yeah, and the consequences were devastating. 12 smoke jumpers lost their lives. Dodge was one of the few survivors, and precisely because he was able to override that ingrained response.
It's fascinating to consider the sheer power of those automatic responses, especially under such duress. Our brains, they're wired to just default to those well-rehearsed behaviors in those moments of perceived danger. It's often, it's an evolutionary advantage.
Right.
But as Man Galt shows, sometimes those instincts can actually work against us, especially when the circumstances change rapidly and we don't have the capacity to rethink our response.
And there was another moment, wasn't there, at Man Gulch that really highlights this rigidity in thinking.
Yeah.
Just before Dodge lit the backfire, he ordered his crew to drop their heavy equipment. Their axes, their saws, shovels, those 20-pound packs they'd been hauling uphill.
It seems obvious, right? If you're running for your life, you shed any extra weight.
Yeah.
But for firefighters, those tools are like an extension of themselves. They're essential.
Right.
Carrying and maintaining that equipment is so deeply ingrained in their training, their identity, that most of them hesitated.
Yeah.
Even when they finally did drop their tools, One firefighter clung to his shovel, and a colleague literally had to pry it from his grasp.
Wow.
Yeah. It's hard to say for certain whether abandoning their tool sooner would have saved any of them, but it certainly underscores how even seemingly logical actions can get blocked by these deep-seated assumptions about what's essential in a given situation.
Yeah, and as you mentioned, Man Gulch wasn't an isolated incident.
Sadly, no. Between 1990 and 1995 alone, 23 wildland firefighters died trying to outrun fires uphill, even though, dropping their gear could have been life-saving.
Yeah.
And in 1994, the Storm King mountain fire in Colorado claimed the lives of 14 firefighters. It's a stark reminder that this failure to rethink basic actions in the face of those rapidly changing situations can have devastating consequences.
So the Man Gulch story really illustrates how critical rethinking is in those immediate life or death situations.
Right.
But this need to reevaluate our assumptions extends far beyond those dramatic scenarios.
Absolutely. Think about the initial response to the coronavirus pandemic. So many world leaders were really slow to rethink their initial assumptions.
Yeah.
The belief that the virus wouldn't significantly impact their countries, that it was no worse than the flu, that it was only spread by people with symptoms.
Right.
And the human cost of that delayed reconsideration is still being felt globally.
And it wasn't just leaders, was it?
No, not at all.
The pandemic really forced almost everyone to question these long-held assumptions about things we'd always taken for granted.
Right.
Like visiting a hospital, eating in a restaurant, even hugging loved ones.
Yeah, our collective mental flexibility was put to the test.
Yeah.
We had to reconsider those norms we'd always relied on.
Yeah, like live sports canceled, commuting to work disrupted for millions,
Yeah.
supply chains disrupted,
Absolutely. We had to rethink our assumptions about the world around us. It became so clear.
So we've established that rethinking is crucial.
Right.
But what are the things that make it so hard to actually do it?
Yeah. Well, there's this concept that psychologists call the totalitarian ego.
Okay.
You can think of it as like your mind's internal editor, this powerful filter that screens out information that threatens your deeply held beliefs and your self-image.
So like a mental gatekeeper protecting us from uncomfortable truths.
Exactly. When a core belief is challenged, it can trigger a fight-or-flight response in the brain, activating the amygdala.
Oh, wow.
That primal part of our brain. And this leads to defensiveness, making us more resistant to new information, no matter how compelling it might be.
It's like that voice in your head that jumps in to defend your opinion, even when you're presented with counter evidence.
Exactly. Like insisting that your old GPS is better than your phone's navigation.
Yeah.
Even when you're clearly lost.
Yes.
So
stubborn.
Exactly. And it's not just internal, right? We create these external environments as well that make it even harder to rethink.
How?
Well, our incorrect opinions can become shielded within these filter bubbles where we primarily encounter information that already supports our convictions. And then those beliefs become even more entrenched in echo chambers.
Yeah.
We're surrounded by people who not only agree with us, but amplify and validate those viewpoints.
And then we have this I'm not biased bias, right?
Yes.
Where we believe that we're more objective than other people.
Which ironically makes us even more vulnerable to our own biases.
Yeah.
And what's really interesting, research suggests that smarter people are actually more prone to this bias blind spot.
That's fascinating.
Yeah, the more skilled you are at thinking, the harder it can be to recognize your own limitations.
It's like being good at thinking can make you worse at rethinking.
In a way, yes, because you become more adept at rationalizing your existing beliefs.
Okay, so how do we break free from all of this?
Well, Adam Grant suggests that we cultivate what he calls a scientist mode mindset.
Okay, what's that?
So it's a fundamental shift from the mental mode of, let's say, a preacher who's focused on broadcasting their truths, a prosecutor who's intent on proving others wrong, or a politician who's primarily concerned with winning over an audience.
So in scientist mode, we're not trying to defend our existing beliefs or convince other people that we're right.
Exactly.
So what does it actually look like to adopt this scientist mode?
Well, in scientist mode, we lead with questions we genuinely seek to understand. We ground our understanding in evidence, and we're open to the possibility that we might be wrong. We're even willing to challenge our own arguments.
This is a real exercise in intellectual humility.
It is. And importantly, in scientist mode, changing your mind isn't a sign of weakness. It's actually a sign of intellectual integrity. It's a step closer to a more accurate understanding of the world.
I love that. So let's look at some real-world examples
of
what happens when we fail to embrace this scientist mode and the importance of rethinking.
Okay.
And I think the story BlackBerry is a really good one.
Yeah, Michael Lazaridis, the co-founder of BlackBerry, he was brilliant at rethinking the design of mobile devices.
Right.
He created this groundbreaking product. But as the smartphone market began to evolve with touchscreens, he had a real resistance to rethinking the market itself.
He was so attached to that physical keyboard, wasn't he?
He was, even as people were clearly gravitating towards touchscreens, he viewed the physical keyboard as a BlackBerry strength and dismissed Apple's decision to go with touchscreen only.
And they even missed out on instant messaging.
Right. They did when colleagues proposed featuring encrypted text messages. Mike was initially receptive, but then he got concerned that it would make the BlackBerry obsolete.
Yeah.
So they abandoned instant messaging, and WhatsApp later capitalized on that.
So despite his brilliance in one area, his unwillingness to rethink the changing landscape ultimately led to his downfall.
Right. His initial success in this case seemed to hinder his ability to adapt.
It's almost like a cautionary tale, right?
Yeah.
Even great achievements and intelligence can blind us to the need for radical rethinking.
Yeah.
So let's contrast that with another tech giant, Apple.
Okay.
Their resurgence is often portrayed as the singular vision of Steve Jobs.
Right. The lone genius.
But the reality is a bit more nuanced.
It is the story often centers on Jobs and his conviction. But the truth is, he was actually against Apple entering the mobile phone market.
Oh, really?
His team had the initial vision, and their persistence and ability to change his mind is what really revitalized the company.
And he famously dismissed the idea of an iPod that was also a phone, right?
Yeah, around 2004, a small group pitched that concept to him, and he was reportedly quite dismissive. He couldn't understand why they'd want to cannibalize the iPod business, and he didn't trust mobile phone carriers. He even said publicly that Apple would never make a phone.
So how did they get him to change his mind?
It was the persistence of his team. They kept presenting the idea, demonstrating its potential, and gradually eroded his resistance.
So even the most visionary leaders need to be open to rethinking. Okay, so we've talked about clinging to beliefs and the pitfalls of that. But let's talk about a seemingly negative trait that can actually be a catalyst for rethinking imposter syndrome.
Yeah, it's an interesting paradox. We usually view imposter syndrome as a bad thing, this sense of inadequacy.
Right.
But as Adam Grant explores, a moderate degree of self-doubt can be quite beneficial.
I like that.
Yeah.
So he draws an analogy to Anton syndrome.
Yes.
Which is a medical condition where individuals who are blind lack awareness of their vision loss.
Right. It's like a blindness to our own blindness.
Yeah. And this brings us to Helle Tomasdottir's experience when she ran for president of Iceland. She actually viewed her imposter syndrome as an advantage.
She did. Despite having the skills and experience, she felt this significant self-doubt like she had as a child piano prodigy who never felt worthy of performing.
Oh, wow.
But instead of letting it paralyze her, she channeled that feeling constructively.
So how did this imposter syndrome actually benefit her campaign? Well, firstly, it motivated her to work harder when you don't have an inflated sense of your chances. You're less afraid to reconsider your strategies.
Okay.
Secondly, it fostered what's called a beginner's mindset, leading her to question assumptions that others might have taken for granted. And thirdly, it made her a better learner. Doubting her own knowledge encouraged her to seek out insights from other people.
That's so counterintuitive, though, right? We associate leadership with confidence.
We do, but research suggests that women, for example, tend to underestimate their leadership skills while men overestimate theirs. And this highlights the difference between confidence and competence.
We've all met those armchair quarterbacks, haven't we?
Exactly. And then there's the Dunning-Kruger effect, where the people who think they know the most often know the least.
Yeah, it's like they're blissfully unaware of their own incompetence.
Precisely. And this isn't just limited to serious matters. Think about common misconceptions, like the idea that Walt Disney personally drew Mickey Mouse.
He didn't. It was Works, or the belief that you can see the Great Wall of China from space.
Right.
You can't with the naked eye, or that sugar makes kids hyperactive. The evidence for that is actually quite weak.
Yeah.
The more superior people perceive their knowledge to be, the more they tend to overestimate their abilities and the less inclined they are to learn and update their understanding.
The example of David Odson, the Icelandic central bank governor with no financial background, is a good illustration of this, right?
He dismissed the advice of experts, seemingly oblivious to his lack of expertise in finance.
Yeah.
In contrast, Halle's imposter syndrome fueled her curiosity and her willingness to learn.
So a dose of self-doubt can be a good thing.
It seems that way, yes.
It can drive growth and rethinking.
Exactly.
Okay, so embracing doubt can be surprisingly beneficial. And this leads to the idea that being wrong isn't necessarily a bad thing.
Yeah.
It can be an opportunity to learn and grow.
It can, as Daniel Kahneman said, being wrong is the only way I feel sure I've learned anything. It's about shifting our perspective, viewing errors, not as failures, but as opportunities for discovery.
But our natural inclination is to resist being wrong.
It is our totalitarian ego works hard to protect our beliefs.
So true.
Remember Henry Murray's study at Harvard, where students' personal philosophies were aggressively challenged? The students who found this the most stressful were the ones whose opinions were deeply intertwined with their identity. An attack on their worldview felt like an attack on themselves.
So how do we learn to detach our opinions from our identity so we can embrace being wrong?
Jean-Pierre's experience forecasting the 2016 U.S. election is insightful. Initially, he gave Trump a 2% chance of winning the nomination.
Wow.
But as Trump's numbers rose, he was willing to question his assessment. He separated his present forecast from his past prediction.
That's key.
It is recognizing that his initial prediction was based on the information available at the time, and new information required reevaluation. Detaching his opinions from his identity was harder because he didn't want Trump to win.
Right.
But he overcame this desirability bias by focusing on a different goal, being the most accurate forecaster.
So truth above personal preference.
Exactly.
But even Jean-Pierre, he wasn't immune to his own feelings.
No. He adjusted his forecast closer to the election, predicting a Clinton victory. And looking back, he admits that he succumbed to desirability bias.
But he's willing to admit that and even laugh at himself for it.
Exactly. And that's the key. Being able to laugh at yourself when you're wrong is a hallmark of intellectual flexibility.
So we need to be comfortable with being wrong ourselves, but how do we encourage others to rethink their beliefs?
Yeah, that's tough, especially when dealing with deeply ingrained views.
Yeah.
It's about understanding the difference between relationship conflict and task conflict.
Okay, relationship conflict being those personal clashes.
Exactly. When disagreements get personal, we dig in our heels. Task conflict, though, focuses on the issue itself, exploring different ideas. This can be constructive because it brings in diverse perspectives and helps us avoid overconfidence. It can surface doubts and lead to rethinking without damaging relationships.
So we should aim for task conflict while minimizing relationship conflict.
Precisely. And we often learn more from those who challenge our thinking than those who validate us.
Right.
Effective leaders engage with their critics. Ineffective ones try to silence them.
But it's uncomfortable to have our ideas questioned.
It is. Research shows that when people are criticized, they tend to avoid the person who gave the feedback. But cultivating what Grant calls a challenge network is invaluable.
Okay, a challenge network.
Yeah, it's a group of people who care enough to give you honest feedback. Think of it as your built-in shock-proof shit detector, as Hemingway put it.
I love that.
People who will tell you when you're wrong, not to be mean, but because they care about your growth.
Like those legendary discussions between Brad Bird and John Walker during the making of The Incredibles.
Yes, they argued constantly, but their intense task conflict resulted in a much better film.
So disagreements can be productive.
They can.
When framed correctly.
Yes, experiments show that framing a dispute as a debate rather than a disagreement signals openness to rethinking this, makes the other person more willing to share information.
Wilbur Wright had this perspective.
He did. He said, honest argument is merely a process of mutually picking the beams and motes out of each other's eyes, so both can see clearly. It wasn't personal. It was about rigorously testing their ideas.
And the example of the preschool subsidies debate is a good one.
Yeah, Harish managed to persuade the audience, even though Debra had more data and initial support.
What were his strategies?
He established common ground. He didn't present his arguments too aggressively.
Avoiding being a logic bully.
Exactly.
Yeah.
He mostly used questions, prompting the audience to examine their assumptions. This encouraged self-persuasion.
And sometimes giving more reasons can backfire.
Right, like in the alumni donation experiment.
Tell me about that one.
When they gave 2 reasons to donate, the rate was lower than when they gave 1. It seems that when people are skeptical, multiple arguments make them more resistant. A single well-reasoned argument feels genuine. Multiple ones can feel like a sales pitch.
So instead of piling on reasons, sometimes it's better to ask questions.
Yes, questions that empower people to articulate their own reasons. This gives them ownership over their conclusions.
And Grant now suggests expressing opinions with a degree of uncertainty instead of strong opinions weakly held.
Yes, expressing opinions with uncertainty signals confident humility.
I like that.
It fosters curiosity and encourages open discussion. It shows that you're receptive to other perspectives.
Michelle Hanson's cover letter is a great example.
Yes, she started by acknowledging her weaknesses, building trust with the reader, and encouraging them to rethink their expectations.
So a gentler approach is often more effective than a forceful one.
It seems that way, yes.
So let's talk about applying these principles to prejudice.
Okay, that's a challenge, but rethinking is possible. Daryl Davis, a black musician who engages with KKK members, is a powerful example. He doesn't shout them down or immediately refute their beliefs. He builds rapport through his music and challenges their stereotypes through conversation.
So it's about destabilizing stereotypes through human connection.
Exactly. Simply emphasizing a shared identity, like being a baseball fan, often doesn't work.
Right.
The ship of Theseus analogy is helpful here. The question of whether an object that's had all its parts replaced is still the same object. This makes us think about how identities, even seemingly fixed ones, are always evolving.
Yeah, it makes you question those fixed team identities.
It does. And to encourage rethinking stereotypes, Grant suggests counterfactual thinking.
Okay.
Asking what if, questions like, how would your stereotypes be different if you were born into a different group? This can foster humility and questioning.
Okay, so let's move on to motivational interviewing.
Yes.
This seems like a gentle and effective way to guide people towards rethinking.
It is. Motivational interviewing is about empathy and listening. It's helping people explore their own reasons for change, not telling them what to do.
Marie-Hélène Etienne Rousseau's story about vaccines is a great example.
Yes, instead of bombarding her with facts, the counselor listened to her concerns, asked open-ended questions, and showed empathy. He built trust, and then shared information tailored to her fears.
And this technique isn't limited to health issues.
No, it's used in business conflict resolution and addiction recovery. It's about identifying change talk statements that indicate a desire or commitment to change, and guiding people to explore those motivations.
So you're like a guide, not a preacher.
Exactly.
But it's important to use it ethically.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
The founders caution against manipulative use and highlight the writing reflex, our urge to jump in and fix things.
Yeah.
Sometimes people just need to be heard.
Right.
Betty Bagam's success in peace talks with Joseph Konya shows the power of listening and empowering people. And listening circles create spaces for open expression, which can lead to less extreme attitudes.
So let's talk about those charged conversations.
Okay.
The ones we tend to avoid.
Yeah. The Difficult Conversations Lab at Columbia found that introducing complexity can disrupt overconfidence and stimulate rethinking.
So Al Gore's communication style on climate change is an interesting case study.
It is. His passion is clear, but framing it as believers versus non-believers creates polarization. It's an us versus them dynamic that makes it harder to engage constructively.
We need to recognize the spectrum of views on complex issues.
Yes, on climate change, there are at least 6 distinct camps.
And even in news reporting, including caveats, can make people more open-minded.
It can. Instead of presenting findings as absolute truth, acknowledging limitations makes readers more receptive.
And expressing care, even when disagreeing, can increase trust.
Yes, people see passion as sincerity, and it's okay to express mixed emotions in charged conversations.
Like Christian Cooper's response to the Central Park incident.
Yes. His expression of mixed emotions encouraged rethinking by acknowledging complexity. He invited others to do the same.
Okay, so let's talk about education. How can we teach students to be better rethinkers?
Aaron McCarthy, who went from museums to teaching history, realized we need to move beyond just facts and encourage students to question and doubt.
To ask, how do we know that?
Exactly. And while delaying exposure to facts is impractical, it shows the importance of unlearning false beliefs early on.
Robert Nozick's experience machine thought experiment is relevant here.
It is. It makes us question the value of passive information versus active engagement.
And assignments like making podcasts that critique TED Talks can foster critical thinking.
Yes.
It's interesting that creative architects often have a B average, and valedictorians might be less likely to challenge the system.
It suggests that fear of being wrong can stifle creativity. Rewarding rethinking, not just memorization, helps shift this.
Ron Berger's approach using grapples sounds great.
It is. He presents students with problems, encouraging them to think independently and collaboratively. This shows there are multiple ways to understand things, and his emphasis on drafts and critique sessions helps them revise their thinking.
So questioning feedback and embracing being wrong are key. Okay, so Organizations, how can they encourage rethinking?
The near disaster with Luca Parmitano's helmet and NASA's normalization of minor issues shows the danger of not rethinking assumptions. The Challenger is another example.
It's the difference between a performance culture and a learning culture.
Exactly. In a learning culture, we ask, how do you know that without being defensive?
Like Ellen Ochoa did at NASA.
Yes, and creating psychological safety where people feel comfortable challenging assumptions and admitting mistakes is key.
Things like the mean reviews video at Wharton and Melinda Gates doing something similar at the Gates Foundation are good examples.
Yes. When leaders share criticisms, it normalizes vulnerability, and it's important to be cautious about best practices they can stifle. Learning better practices is a better focus.
And process accountability is crucial, too.
Absolutely. The learning zone is where psychological safety and accountability intersect. Separating the evaluation of the process from the outcome is important, too.
So finally, let's talk about rethinking our own lives.
The story of Ryan Grant wanting to be a neurosurgeon and burning out shows the danger of not rethinking life plans.
Yeah.
Escalation of commitment fueled by grit can make us persist in things that aren't working. And identity foreclosure, settling on a career too early, can lead to regret.
So shorter-term planning and staying open to possibilities is better?
Yes, and rethinking doesn't have to be drastic. Sometimes it's small adjustments that bring new meaning. Like Candace Walker, the custodian, who redefined her role.
It comes back to trying something, as Roosevelt said.
Yes, experimentation is key for rethinking.
So to recap, we talked about seizing and freezing.
Yes.
Cultivating a scientist mindset.
Yes.
The barriers to rethinking.
The totalitarian ego over confidence.
And the benefits of doubt and conflict.
Yes.
And strategies for encouraging rethinking.
Asking questions, listening. Embracing complexity, fostering safety.
So for you, the learner, this deep dive was about understanding how to navigate information challenge assumptions and approach learning with curiosity. So here's a final thought. Consider one belief you hold strongly. What evidence would cause you to rethink it?
It's a great question to ponder.
It is. It's about continuous learning and unlearning.
Exactly.
Thanks for joining us.
It was my pleasure.
Until next time, keep thinking.
And rethinking.
Absolutely.
Yeah.